Welcome to Hiding in Plain Sight, Oklahoma's robust passenger rail legislation and an Amtrak report. Representative Ken Luttrell is going to begin this meeting. Welcoming everybody. Representative Luttrell.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and I thank you for joining in this meeting this morning of the Passenger Rail Caucus virtual meeting. I know many of you had some late nights this last week as it was deadline week here in Oklahoma. Appreciate anyone joining from Kansas, our fellow legislators and supporters of passenger rail. So welcome this morning. Thank you for taking time to join in on this and looking forward to an informative educational meeting today. Our facilitator today is Mark Corriston from the Northern Flyer Alliance. So Mark, if you want to kick things off for us.
Thank you, Representative Luttrell. I am Mark Corriston, Secretary Treasurer of the Northern Flyer Alliance. As we get started, I want to acknowledge and thank Deborah Fischer Stout, President of the Northern Flyer Alliance, for organizing and producing this virtual meeting. I also want to thank Gary Landman, President of the Friends of the Northern Flyer Alliance, for managing our technical systems of the virtual meeting today. There are a few housekeeping rules we would like to go over before beginning the meeting. And with that, we ask attendees to keep your video turned off and muted until we open the meeting for questions. We also encourage you to ask questions in the chat feature as they occur to you. At the end of the presentations, we will answer your questions from the chat. And then in the time remaining, invite you to open your microphones to ask any additional questions you have at that time. Our speakers today include Shelby Templin, who is the Active Transportation Coordinator, Multimodal Division of the Oklahoma Department of Transportation. Deborah Fischer Stout, as mentioned, who is President of the Northern Flyer Alliance. And also joining the presenters today is Todd Stennis, who is Senior Manager of Amtrak Government Affairs South Central Region. Our speakers have a lot to share today, so let's go ahead and begin. Next slide. Shelby.
All right. Good morning, everyone. As Mark mentioned, my name is Shelby Templin. My title is Active Transportation Coordinator with the Oklahoma Department of Transportation. My background and emphasis really is in bicycle and pedestrian planning efforts. But since ODOT has gone through a little bit of a reorganization, we have created this new multimodal division, which is spearheaded by my supervisor, Jared Swennison, who is also on this call and will be available for questions throughout the entire presentation. But to take a little bit of the slack off of Jared, I have taken on the Heartland Flyer and Amtrak coordination efforts, in addition to bicycle and pedestrian planning. So that's a little bit of background and kind of what my information will be today. Is very high level, very just informational as far as how ODOT gets funding for the Heartland Flyer. So go ahead and go to the next slide. And then next slide. So our basic, where all of the funding started for the Heartland Flyer really comes from this Oklahoma Tourism and Passenger Rail Act. This was passed initially in 1996 and then amended in 2001. Essentially, this act was, and everything you see in quotes. Did the slides go blank for everyone else?
Yes, they did.
Okay. There we go. In my portion of the presentation, anything you see in quotes is directly from legislation. So here you can see the purpose of this act was to do all things necessary to restore passenger rail service to the state, to enhance the state's position as a tourist destination site, and to improve the quality of life for residents. Prior to 1996, and really prior to 1999, we had lost all passenger rail service in the state of Oklahoma. And the legislature at that time decided we really want to get things going again. We want Amtrak access. And so they passed this Oklahoma Tourism and Passenger Rail Act. And essentially all this did at this time was establish that there needed to be a fund. Next slide. So this Oklahoma Tourism and Passenger Rail Act created a fund, the Oklahoma Tourism and Passenger Rail Revolving Fund in the State Treasurer's Office that was dedicated for the Department of Transportation to establish passenger rail. It was dedicated funding, was a continuing fund, not subject to fiscal year limitations, and composed of all revenues generated together with any federal grants, contributions by any other state, private donation, etc. Like I said, it established the fund to be able to get passenger rail back in Oklahoma. Next slide. So at that point, we had the fund established, and now we needed money to go into that fund. So the legislature passed the Rebuilding Oklahoma Access and Driver Safety Fund, which at ODOT, we do a lot of acronyms, so we know that as the Roads Fund. This was an annual apportionment to ODOT. It's a much larger funding pot, but $2 million of that Roads Fund was specifically apportioned to be used for capital and operating costs for the Heartland Flyer Rail project. So at that point, we had the $2 million dedicated to fund the Heartland Flyer. Next slide. So then at that point, we realized that there was a little bit of a gap in funding. So the state of Oklahoma levies a gasoline tax of 16 cents per gallon purchased in the entire state. About 64% of that gasoline tax collected is required to be transferred into the state transportation fund. And so that number fluctuates as gas consumption changes, as price of gas changes, things like that. That total number can fluctuate, but $850,000 of that money that is collected is required to be transferred also into that Oklahoma Tourism and Passenger Rail Revolving Fund. So at that point, we've got the fund, we've got it established, we've got the $2 million that's dedicated every year, and then also $850,000 that is dedicated every year. Next slide. So currently, Oklahoma and Texas DOT currently split the cost of operating the Heartland Flyer. The annual apportionment that is due to Amtrak annually, approximately, it's an average amount, but right now we pay about $3 million to operate the Heartland Flyer. As you all know, our apportionment is $2.85 million from the state legislature. So obviously there's a little bit of a gap. We've got about a $0.15 million gap that we have to fund. Thankfully, in the early 2010s, we had very high ridership. A lot of that was due to just kind of the overall national recession. Ridership was up also due to rising gas prices. So we've been kind of, in a way, coasting a little bit, making up those gaps with those ridership surpluses from the early 2010s. So at a certain point, those surpluses will run out, but that's kind of how we're funding things currently. Next slide. Obviously, we're always looking for opportunities for more funding. As a lot of you may know, recently Congress passed what is called the IIJA. That's the annual funding, or it funds all state DOTs essentially. But within that, we've got some opportunities for discretionary grant funding. And for those that don't know, discretionary grants require a match from the state DOT or whoever it is that is applying. So that may be an opportunity. We will have to put forth money for a match, but we do have that possibly as an opportunity. And one of the issues, as everyone knows, costs on everything continue to go up. Costs to operate the Heartland Flyer continue to increase annually, both on the operating side as well as the capital side. And as of right now, we currently just do what we do with our 2.85 million, and we find the money to make up those gaps, but the costs are going to continue to increase, so we will need to start to get a little creative and find other opportunities for funding. So with that, that concludes my portion of the presentation. Do we want to do questions now or at the end?
At the end.
Okay, all right.
And anybody who is having questions, if you'd like to put them in the chat right now while they're fresh in your mind, that would be good. Thank you, Shelby. Our next speaker is Deborah Fischer Stout, and she will speak about unique finance options that we are discovering all over the country. Deborah.
Thank you, Mark, for that introduction. So yes, as Mark said, what I'm going to be talking about today are very unique finance options. And there are a number of states across the US that have state-supported passenger rail service. And the 5 states I'm going to be talking about do not use the typical avenue, which is general funds. So as many of you know, restoration and enhancement grants are available for new starts for years 1 through 6 for operational support. The split begins in year 1, 90% Fed, 10% state, down to 30% Fed, 70% state. Our hope is that the mechanisms that I'm going to be talking about are inspirational for both Oklahoma and Kansas as they determine ways in which they might fill in the gaps between grant funding, dedicated funding, and full support for the Heartland Flyer and its extension. Next slide. So the first state is Maine, and Maine operates 1 train, and it's known as the Downeaster. It's 5 trains a day, with the endpoints being Portland, Maine, and Boston, Massachusetts. The reason why I wanted to start with Maine is because the Downeaster is similar to the Heartland Flyer extension in that it runs through more than 1 state. It actually runs through 3 states, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine. And we had the executive director, Patricia Quinn, speak to us virtually last spring to the Kansas Rail Caucus. And we were very impressed with what she had to say about the Downeaster. The state of Maine operationally supports this train all by itself. It does not get any help from New Hampshire or Massachusetts because it's that important to the state of Maine. So there's tremendous economic development and tax revenue generation as a result of this train. But how they fund it is very interesting. 80% of the funding comes through CMAQ funds, Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality, which is a Federal Transit Administration grant. And then the remaining 20% comes from car rental sales tax. The second state I want to talk about is Oregon. The train known as Cascades runs through both Oregon and Washington and into British Columbia. So Oregon's portion of Cascades is essentially operating 2 to 3 round-trip trains a day over various segments of the Cascades. A portion of the operational support comes from customized license plates. A portion comes from gas tax from fuel in snowmobiles and lawnmowers, which we thought was interesting. And then they use a different kind of grant funding known as FTA 5307, which is an urbanized area formula funding program. Next slide. Washington's portion of the Cascades is a little bit more robust. 8 round-trip trains a day over different segments with plans for 13 round-trip trains. So no funding from the general fund. What they fund it with is vehicle registration fees and some retail sales taxes, such as surcharge on car rentals. The next state is a little closer to home, Michigan. 5 round-trip trains a day on 3 different routes. So in other words, Michigan supports 3 different state-supported trains, all with different names. Funded through 2/3 vehicle registration fees and a fuel tax, and 1/3 is from sales tax on new cars and other automotive-related items. Then the last state I want to talk to you about is Pennsylvania. 2 round-trip trains a day on 2 different routes. Once again, using FTA 5307, it's an urbanized area, funding mechanism once again, and then sales tax revenue. Next slide. So I am no expert in grant funding or operational support, but what I'm providing you today is readily available information. And since some of these states use CMAQ funds, I wanted to do a little bit of research regarding that and was very encouraged with some of the information that I found, and so decided to share it. Now, IIJA, the document, can be found on our website, and through a few keyword searches, I found the following 2 to 3 paragraphs. So beginning with this one, operating assistance is limited to startup operating costs for new transportation services or the incremental cost of expanding services, including intercity passenger rail. So we were very encouraged to read that. Next slide. So a little bit more definition. This one has to do with eligibility. I'd like you to focus on the double I, a state-supported Amtrak route with a valid cost-sharing agreement under PREA Section 209, which is how the Heartland Flyer operates. Again, encouraging information. And then the second paragraph, no time limitation. Operating assistance shall have no imposed time limitation if the operating assistance is for I, a non-urbanized area, or double I, an urbanized area with a population of 200,000 or fewer, which is pretty much the description of the entire corridor from Oklahoma City to Newton, with perhaps the exception of Wichita. Next slide. Speaking of Wichita, FTA 5307, of course, is the urban area formula funds. I'd like you to focus on the dark blue text. The designated recipient would be in an urbanized area with 200,000 people or more. So again, encouraging. It's possible that we could take advantage of one or both of these other federally funded grants. So next slide. This concludes my presentation, and thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. Next slide. Our final speaker is Todd Stennis from Amtrak.
Good morning, Mark. Thank you very much. Deborah, it's a pleasure to see you all this morning. I know there are many people online with us this morning that I've had the pleasure, along with my colleagues, Rob Eaton and Derek James, to meet with you in a previous visit out to Kansas and Oklahoma just a couple of weeks ago. So again, it's a pleasure talking with you this morning, and look forward to having this conversation. I apologize, Derek was not able to join us. He had a family emergency this morning and is not able to attend. So on that note, I will cover the Amtrak portion of this presentation. For those of you that are not familiar with Amtrak state-supported services, we have 19 state partners throughout the country. Oklahoma and Texas are 2 of those state partners that we've had since 1999. Actually, Texas came on afterwards. I don't want to give them full credit for the Heartland Flyer since it was all started in Oklahoma. But nonetheless, they joined at a later date and time. And as has been mentioned already, they split the cost with the state of Oklahoma. Not quite 50-50, but relatively close for the service of the Heartland Flyer. So to that end, a couple of things have changed throughout the years. Number one, the PREA legislation came along in 2009 or 2008 rather, and that really changed the dynamic of how Amtrak intercity passenger trains are funded, for those of you that are not fully aware of it. And the key component as it relates to what we're talking about here today with the Heartland Flyer is any service less than 750 miles, those costs are borne primarily by the states, and that's where the 19 state partnerships come in. And that's under Section 209 of the PREA language. So we fast forward to where we are today, and we've had many conversations about extending the Heartland Flyer north to Kansas, but the key impediment was the lack of a funding mechanism. Up until now, everything was 100% entirely on the states to come up with whatever that mechanism was going to be in identifying where those resources were going to come from. So now all of a sudden we have the IIJA funding, and again, the IIJA funding is the game changer for where we are and where we want to move forward. Let's talk about that for just a moment. We don't have all of the specific details to where or what the guidelines are going to be, if I may, for the IIJA funding or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So what we have to do now is we want to prepare going forward, and what are the steps going to be? And I think the first step that we want to talk about is, what do we have to do to get in the game? And let's go ahead and go to the next slide here so we can talk a little bit about where we are with the flyer and the things that are going to be related to IIJA. So we've got the route structure here for everybody to look at, and anybody that's questioning the cities that are identified, I can tell you those were the previously served cities in the pre-1979 Amtrak service. So that's where those are identified on the route north of Oklahoma City. When we talk about extending the flyer north, obviously that would include the state of Kansas as a state partner in that process. So that's the reason why we've been out visiting with Oklahoma and Texas in the last couple of weeks. But let's talk about IIJA for just a minute, and let me tell you about what we know to date. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide if we may. So, and one more after that if we could. I thought you had the other.
Yes, yeah, Gary is going to share his screen for
Okay.
that.
Yeah, because we had the back side of that
Yes.
that
and
slide there. I wanted everybody to have the ability to
Yes.
look at.
That's a single document that was too large for the PowerPoint, so he's going to.
Okay.
Share
There we
that.
go. Okay. So the IIJA funding has got a couple of key pots of money in it. It's got $66 billion in it for rail. Not 100% of that is for intercity passenger rail, but let's go down the way we have it broken out here into the three categories. The $22 billion, there's $22 billion of that is specifically for Amtrak, and that is for infrastructure in the Northeast Corridor, long distance equipment and things of that nature that are really items that are on a backlog that need to be addressed for Amtrak. But what's key for you guys is the $36 billion in the FRA funding that is the second item, as well as the $8 billion in rail safety money, because both are relevant to the Heartland Flyer service. When you look at that, you say, okay, what's the breakout going to look like? We don't completely know exactly what that's going to look like right now, but what I can tell you is you're going to have two pots of money that are critical to that, and one is going to be in the Chrissy grant funding, which is 80-20 grant money. And that is your capital dollars. And as mentioned earlier, as Shelby mentioned earlier, there's going to be a required match to go with that. And states across the country that are vying to do the same thing that you are will be pursuing that money as well. So the key there is to get ourselves in a position where we know what kind of capital dollars are we going to need going forward. And I'm going to touch on that in just a moment. The flip side to that is the operating side. Something that we haven't had until recent years is matching operating dollars from the federal government. We had a program that was started just a few years ago. That was called the Restoration and Enhancement Grant Fund. The fund was originally set up as 80-60-40 money, meaning 80% the first year, 60 the second, 40 the third. The IIJA bill has changed that to a 6-year program, and it now starts at 90% in the first year and goes down 10% per year, 80, 70, 60, 40. So your first 6-year window, there is a mechanism in place to support the operation of the service and getting it off the ground. And the purpose behind that is to build a business up and to generate more business and more revenue. So by the time we get to year 7, we've got a pretty good idea of what it's going to cost for the annual appropriation to run the service, regardless of what that mechanism is that pays for it. So those are the two key things that we know at the 20,000 foot level, if I may, about the IIJA fund at this time. The other thing that we are really focused on at this moment as it relates to you guys and everybody else, and that is that we know that the IIJA is going to require through the FRA that each route is identified as a route that is approved by the FRA. So that's really step one in the process for us, is making sure that the FRA recognizes the extension of the Heartland Flyer as one of those routes. We have been meeting with legislators, mayors, and other city government officials, as well as county government officials in the last couple of weeks. And the message that we've put out is the same message I'm going to share with you today. And that is that we want to make sure that your respective state governments know that that is objective number one. And that is to make sure the FRA receives any type of, whether it is through resolution or letters of support, notice that you want this route recognized as one of the routes certified by the FRA or recognized by the FRA. And one thing else also to notice in the money up there is the $36 billion is not $36 billion going to Amtrak. That is money that is going through the FRA. So the states are going to apply for that money directly to the FRA. Now, that will not be done through Amtrak. Another key point to note there. So again, back to step one. Step one is getting the routes recognized. In conjunction with that, something that's already being done and where you guys kind of have a head start is KDOT has already taken the lead on doing the analysis on the route for the capacity analysis. It's going to be required so we can identify, as I previously mentioned, what are the capital dollars that are going to be required. I know Jared's with us today, and I know he's going to be working with KDOT on that, as well as the BN Santa Fe Railroad. So those are all of the key parties that we want involved in that. And that, Jared, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the timeline for the completion of that capacity analysis is around February of 23, which is good because that coincides with the timeline with the FRA process of getting IIJA kicked off. The first date that we have that I'm aware of at this hour is May the 14th. That is the date that we are told that, unless it pushes, that we are told that we're going to get the guidelines from the FRA on how the money can be spent, who the applicants can be, and all of the greater level of detail. So we're looking forward to getting that, and that should really help us out a lot in the coming months, because you're going to have a 12-month window once we get that to that date of May the 14th. You'll have a year essentially to send those letters of support in, send those resolutions. And the FRA does not have to wait for a year to identify a route. They can identify it anytime in that window, but that window of 1 year is the window of getting the route identified. So we want to do that as quickly as possible. That way, when we get done with the capacity analysis in February of 23, you guys are in a position to go ahead and start making the decision, okay, what are we going to go after? What capital dollars do we need? And I've had several legislators, both in Kansas and in Oklahoma, ask, what is the ask? What's the financial ask? Well, we don't know the answer to that question, and we're not going to know it until we get that study completed. So the good news right now is, for anybody that's looking for what the ask is we would like to have the support of everybody that we can get to get the route identified. That's in my opinion, that's a whole heck of a lot better than going to them and asking for any type of money at this hour. So the first thing is, again, being redundant, is getting the route identified. Subsequently, once we have the study complete, is to move forward on identifying what it is that we need, and then what are those resources, where it's going to come from. Deborah mentioned earlier going over the other states and what they do to not only fund the services, but what are their mechanisms that they use. One that I'd just like to add to the fray, if I may, Deborah, is the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Yes.
The Commonwealth of Virginia has a unique mechanism. I'm going to sidebar here for just a moment. When the PREA legislation went through in 2008, the Commonwealth of Virginia quickly recognized that they had several services that were going to be transitioned from being under the Amtrak umbrella to being under the state umbrella. So the Department of Rail and Public Transportation, as well as the legislature, worked to create a mechanism, and that mechanism was IPROC. It's the Intercity Passenger Rail Operating and Capital Fund. It is a unique mechanism in that the money that's in there can be used by the Department of Rail and Public Transportation for capital or operations of the train. So they've got, it's essentially flex dollars that they have to use there. And it's also indexed, so it increases every little bit every few years. And they have used that to expand intercity passenger rail service throughout the Commonwealth since that time. It took 3 legislative sessions, if memory serves me right. They created the mechanism, and then it took 3 years to get it funded. So it wasn't something that just happened overnight. It took a period of time and a couple of sessions to get that up and going. But that's just one more to mention as far as what other states are doing out there. We are staring down the barrel of starting a new service on the Gulf Coast. And that's going to be the first new service we're going to start. And we're looking right now at those state partners and how that's going to work out in the coming years. But obviously, those dollars are already in place for capital and operations because of the R&E and the CRISI grants that were already in place that I mentioned earlier, which was really the genesis of what's going to be used in IIJA. So with that, I conclude my remarks, but I'm happy to answer any questions at this time. And again, I think the message for everybody is we want to press forward on letters of support and or resolutions to get the route identified with the FRA. One thing that you may ask is, where do those letters need to go to? They need to go to ODOT. They need to go to KDOT. I think every letter and resolution that Jared gets, not to overwhelm him with a bunch of paper, but everything he gets helps him in his position of with the ODOT, as well as getting those resolutions to the governor's office and the legislative delegation as well, coming from the local level, and then subsequently coming from the legislature to go to FRA. So ultimately, everything needs to go to FRA. But in any event, that is where we need to go as far as identifying what we want to do going forward with the route structure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Todd. Great presentation. And at this time, let's move on to the chat questions. And I see that there aren't any actual, oh, there's one new one. Okay. This is a question for Jared and Shelby. Will ODOT be the lead for the designated corridor status?
Hey, this is Jared Schwinnison, and yes, we will be the lead, and we've already helped with the guidance. We answered some questionnaires for the FRA. We are fully involved with that process, and we will continue doing that. And Shelby's going to be the lead on all those efforts.
Wonderful, and thank you. The other comment is one key aspect of this infrastructure project. This is just a kind of a factoid. One nice aspect of this infrastructure project is that sets it aside from most others is that it's not going to involve eminent domain issues, which are always controversial things to deal with. And so having said that, are there any direct questions that anybody wants to answer outside of chat?
You can go ahead and unmute if you do.
Unmute your phone, unmute your speakers or your microphones.
Hello.
Mr. Fortney.
Well, this is actually Steve Gentling here in Guthrie with Justin and other staff. But a couple things. Todd, when we were last talked, I thought you had mentioned that there might be some bullet points that that you could send out, or that somebody could send out to make sure that we incorporate those into our letters of support or resolutions. Is that still something that's going to come out to us?
Yes, sir, it is. Derek and I are working on that now. And Mayor, one of the key components there, as I mentioned earlier, I think that the focus today, any letters of support or resolutions that are going out right now will be generic in nature. And I don't want that to sound negative, but they really have to be generic in nature, pointed at the route identification with the FRA. And I say that because, again, we don't have those specific details yet. If we want to do, we can do this one of two ways. You can go ahead and start sending things in now that are more generic in nature that Derek and I will be submitting bullet points to you all for, or anybody that's asking for bullet points or talking points, which we can do that. Or we can also wait until after the May 14th deadline, which there's no downside to waiting till May the 14th. But once we know the details after the May the 14th, we'll have a greater level of information that we can share with everybody. So it's really a matter of choice right now. But we're happy to go ahead and get that to you as quickly as we can, which again, Derek and I are already working on that.
Okay,
Great.
thanks, Todd.
Yes, sir.
Another comment. I don't know how much you're also incorporating dealing with the councils of government, the COGs, in your travels around the state. But let me just refer the Oklahoma City COG, ACOG. I was with a group of 6 that recently was in Washington, D.C., and we met with our federal legislators, senators and congressmen, and the expansion of the Heartland Flyer is a priority identified by the ACOG that they are totally supporting. And that was verbalized by the executive director, Mark Sweeney. But the other opportunity that we had, I was part of that group, was for each of the cities that were represented, which was Edmond and Guthrie on the tour, on the line here anyway. And we both, of course, referenced a priority to identify that corridor, the I-35 corridor, if you will, and provide support. I will say that there was a question by Senator Langford concerning, I had used the 65,000 annual ridership, and he questioned that a bit. I don't know if we have data that you could share with us that would include trended data of that ridership, and also how the projected, what was it, 118,000 projected annual use, how that was established, developed, whatever, to assist as we further explain the not only the history but the potential future use.
Mayor, real quick, just so that I understand, what was the question about the ridership not being under 65,000 over the last, I don't know, I'm not looking at it right now, but I know it's been a number of years since the ridership.
The comment that I had made to the senator was that over the last few years, it's averaged 65,000 annually. And there was a bit pushback there of where those numbers came from. If you will.
I can get those numbers for you because we have the ridership numbers for every fiscal year dating back to 1999. We obviously have to have a record of it in place from a standpoint of ridership and revenue, because without that, we cannot develop the numbers for the states of Oklahoma and Texas and what you've got to put together. Because as Shelby mentioned earlier, the ridership was really high for a couple of years there. So there was a credit that was actually in place that Oklahoma is benefiting from today. So in any event, I'm happy to share those ridership numbers with you and happy to have a conversation with anybody that wants to ask questions about it, because we keep that online. In fact, Mayor, if you would, I don't know that we've got them updated just yet, but we have what's known as a state fact sheet. It's a public document that's on Amtrak.com. And we usually have the 2 most recent fiscal years online at Amtrak.com at any given time, where anybody can go in and look at it and see what the ridership numbers are, not only for the state as a total, but also for the individual communities that we serve. So it doesn't matter whether it's Oklahoma, Texas, or any other of the lower 46 that we serve. So that can be seen there as well. But again, I'm happy to have a conversation with anybody that has any questions about the ridership or how that is, how that's derived. And as far as going forward, that projection actually came from, if memory serves me right, that ridership projection of the 118,000 came from the 2017 study that was done that identified not only the 118,000 in ridership, but it also had an identification of what the capacity improvements were going to be, which at that time, Jared, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was about $124 million broken down between the 2 respective states. But that's for that information. Again, I'm again, being redundant, happy to have a conversation with anybody who wants to discuss.
Okay, appreciate that information. On a positive note, there was, with that one blip, there was significant support at the federal level to fill the quote gap that's obvious when you look at the network of Amtrak in the United States, and that gap being the corridor we're talking about. So that was fully recognized and supported by the congressmen and senators that we talked to, or their staff.
Mayor, I appreciate you bringing that up. Just real quick, if I may, one thing I didn't mention earlier in our meeting that we had in Wichita, the Senator Moran and the congressman's staff were also, two congressional districts were also represented staff-wise in that meeting. And they all agreed to work to put together a sign-on letter, an I-35 sign-on letter at the federal level as well to go to the FRA. So that was just something I want to mention as a sidebar, that they were working to pursue that and getting both United States senators in Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, as well as the congressional offices from Newton all the way down to Fort Worth to do a sign-on letter as well. So just as a sidebar, I wanted to mention that to everybody.
Great.
That's great news.
I saw that Roland Peterson appeared to wish to speak a few moments ago.
Yes, thank you. Partially your questions were answered, but I was wondering how that capacity you kept talking about, how would you determine that? And what criteria are you using? Is that just from past, or are we talking about a different type of capacity?
Jared, can you answer that?
I can, happy to. So in 2019, actually BNSF provided an estimate for how much capital improvement to their track it would take to make sure their freight could continue to run along with the Heartland Flyer activity extending north to Newton, Kansas. That was for $124 million is what they stated at that time. And currently 93 million of that is in Oklahoma specifically. And that is currently the latest estimate we've gotten from the BNSF to run this on their line. So specifically capacity as in, can you move more trains during the day and night? Because that line, including the Heartland Flyer, has about 32 to 42 trains per day.
Yes, that's what I was wondering. Wasn't sure whether that was talking about number of riders or whether it was actually talking about trains. But thank you, appreciate that.
You're welcome.
I see a statement in the chat that indicates that the service development plan, this was Kansas's plan from 2011, saw a projected increase in ridership to 200,000 a year based on the study done by Parsons Brinkerhoff. So we're gonna see an increase, I'm sure. Are there any other questions? Speak now. And if there aren't,
This is Tom Brown, Chair of REAP in South Central Kansas Regional Economic Area Partnership. I lost part of my screen just now, but you mentioned a part on municipalities, metropolitan areas over 200,000. John Rolfe's on this call, and I know you may have covered this when you're meeting in Kansas, and I'm sure that Pete Meissner and others are aware of this, but if Deborah or somebody, how do I get that to have our organization support whatever you need on metropolitan area over 200,000? Because we have a 10-county area in our organization that in smaller municipalities, including Newton, in larger Wichita, we should have a program on this and pull together better than maybe we are right now.
Yeah, sure. Well, like I say, I am not a funding expert, but my understanding of how this should proceed would be probably through KDOT. They're typically the ones that seek grants for the state, and they do have a dedicated grant writer. I apologize, I'm not remembering her name at the moment. Perhaps Gary or Mark could help me with that. But I would reach out to them and I can get back to you. I've got that name somewhere. So
okay, yeah, just send me an email.
Sure.
You do frequently, so that's okay. And there's a meeting coming up with KDOT in April in Wichita, so I want to be sure that we ask the right questions there.
Sure, absolutely.
I see Corey Davis is with us today. Corey, could you tell us who the grant writer that KDOT has hired?
Yeah, her name is Vanessa Lamoureux, but I would encourage any conversations with KDOT regarding this service would go through me in my office. So I would be the contact for anything related to this extension.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
I would just like for Steve Houck, since he's still on the line, to talk about what the city of Shawnee is doing currently, if you don't mind, Steve.
Let's see. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
City of Shawnee is engaged in a infrastructure study for a major corridor on the west side of our city to come off of K7 highway. In that corridor, it runs along the BNSF route that hosts the Southwest Chief. We are currently looking for money from the base grants that should be announced today, I believe, as a matter of fact, to fund a study for the opportunity to put a train station in this corridor, along with the other infrastructure improvements that would serve all of Johnson County and Wyandotte County. And it would literally be the only train stop between the Union Station and Lawrence, Kansas.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
So there is in the chat box from Jared, would you please send out the presentations for today to all participants, which leads me to, in closing, to say that copies of today's presentations will be distributed to the Passenger Rail Caucus and attendees. And I want to thank all of those people who are here today from both Kansas and Oklahoma. I see legislators from both states and city officials. Recordings of our past caucus presentations are also posted on our Northern Flyer Alliance website. And if you go to that and go to the media tab and then select videos, you can see them. Lastly, we wish to invite all of you to a second caucus meeting for both Kansas and Oklahoma. The dates are not yet confirmed, and we will share those in a saved date email when we know for sure when we're going to have it. We hope to see you all again, and thank you for attending. And Representative Luttrell, do you have any closing remarks you'd like to make at this time?
Yes, thank you very much. I just want to send a special thank you out to the mayors and the chambers of commerce that have stepped up to the plate and supported this and energizing their communities in letters of support, reaching out to their legislators. Certainly none of us that are serving currently are experts in this. I can certainly relate with you, Deborah, that we're not experts in seeking this funding or experience in seeking these grants, and we certainly appreciate your guidance in this. And I'd also like to say a special thank you to Secretary Gatz, Jared, and Shelby for your help and being willing to come by the office and discuss this and really take the lead on this that we don't have the expertise to do, but to kind of guide us through this. I appreciate everyone so much. On behalf of my family, myself, my mayor, thank you all very much. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Well, my thanks also to everybody, and we're going to close the meeting at this time. So have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.